I was about to walk down the aisle, the music was playing, guests stood in anticipation, and my heart was pounding with excitement. It was supposed to be the happiest day of my life, my wedding day. But fate had a different plan for me. Just seconds before my grand entrance, I realized I had forgotten the flower pin my father always wore on special occasions. Panicked, I turned back through the hallway to the prep room we had used earlier that morning. I pushed the door open without knocking, and there he was, my fiancé Tyler, in his tuxedo, holding someone in his arms. Her back was to me, but I recognized the dress instantly. It was the blush satin gown I had helped choose. Megan, my younger sister, my bridesmaid. They didn't notice me at first. His hand was on her waist, her fingers tangled in his hair, their lips locked like no one else existed. My breath caught in my throat. I blinked, hoping it was some twisted misunderstanding, but then she giggled, the same laugh I'd heard my whole life, and said, "God, I wish this was our wedding." He smiled and replied, "Someday, Meg. Someday it will be." I stepped back quietly. No scream, no confrontation, just a shattering silence. I met Tyler Mitchell during my sophomore year at NYU. He was the confident, funny business major guy who somehow managed to make financial analysis sound sexy. I was an English literature student with ink-stained fingers and a head full of stories. We were different in every conceivable way. But when he offered me the last copy of a textbook we both reached for, something clicked. Our first date was a coffee cart on 8th Street and a shared umbrella in the rain. He listened when I talked about Austin and Wolf. I listened when he mapped out tech trends with a napkin and a ballpoint pen. We built something slowly, brick by brick. After college, I took a copywriting job to pay bills while he launched a small software startup out of our cramped apartment. I believed in him more than anyone else. I edited his pitch decks at midnight, made calls for him when he was too anxious to speak, and used my modest savings to buy him his first MacBook. For years, we lived on hope and instant noodles, but we were happy. He'd surprise me with notes on the bathroom mirror, whisper his dreams to me while we fell asleep. "One day, Em, will make it big," he used to say, and I never doubted him. My family adored him, especially Megan. She was 4 years younger than me and still in high school when Tyler and I moved in together. He tutored her in math, cheered at her dance recitals, even drove her to prom when her date bailed last minute. I thought it was sweet, proof he'd be a great father someday. When his startup finally got funded, everything changed. We moved into a nicer place. I quit my job and joined his company full-time, managing branding and communications. We worked late, laughed over client calls, celebrated every tiny victory with cheap champagne in the kitchen. Tyler proposed during a weekend in Vermont, just the two of us, snow falling gently around a cabin he rented. I cried. He cried. Megan was the first person I called. She screamed in excitement, told me she'd always known we were perfect together. I never questioned her closeness with Tyler. She was my sister, my best friend. He was my soulmate. And I was so busy building our life that I ignored the little voices, the subtle signs. When Mom died 2 years ago, Megan moved in with us for a while. I was grateful to have her near. She helped with meals, kept me company when Tyler traveled. I even encouraged her to apply for a position at the company. She became our junior marketing assistant, and I was proud of her. I thought we were a team. I thought I had it all. Looking back now, I wonder when it started. Was it the time I saw them whispering in the hallway and she blushed? Or when he forgot our anniversary but remembered her favorite gelato flavor? Maybe it was always there, a slow betrayal blooming beneath the surface. But back then, I was blind with trust. I believed in us, in him, in her. There were nights when Tyler and I would lie in bed, dreaming aloud about the future. We talk about baby names, about converting the guest room into a nursery. He once sketched out the floor plan of our forever home on a napkin at a diner, and I kept it in my wallet for years. That was how much I believed in him, in us. When Megan got accepted into a master's program in digital media, I was the one who encouraged her to defer and gain work experience. You'll learn more in a year with us than 2 in a classroom, I told her. Tyler nodded in agreement. I thought we were helping her. I even let her borrow my clothes for meetings, lent her jewelry for client events, made sure she always looked polished. I wanted her to feel confident, capable, prepared for the world. She was family. She was my baby sister, and I was proud to share everything I had. Sometimes I caught Tyler looking at her with a strange softness. I mistook it for brotherly affection. Sometimes she hugged him a second too long. I told myself I was imagining things. After all, we were planning a wedding, a future. I remember the day I picked out my dress. Megan came with me, holding up veils, snapping photos, tearing up when I stepped out of the dressing room in lace and silk. You look like someone from a dream, she whispered. Now I wonder if she meant it like a wish, if somewhere deep down she was imagining herself in that dress with Tyler waiting at the altar. But back then, I just hugged her tighter. I thought I was the luckiest woman alive. The shift was gradual, almost invisible at first. Tyler started coming home later and later. Investor dinners, he'd say, brushing off my questions with a quick kiss and a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. At work, he became more impatient. My suggestions during team meetings were met with tight-lipped nods or quick dismissals. Let's stay focused, Emily, he'd say, glancing toward Megan, who suddenly had a seat at every major pitch, every important call. She was rising fast, too fast. And I tried to be proud, tried to ignore the twist in my stomach every time she laughed at one of Tyler's jokes a little too loud. Once, during a product launch meeting, I presented a rebranding strategy I'd worked on for weeks. Tyler barely glanced at the slides before interrupting me. We're going in a different direction, he said flatly, then turned to Megan. What was that tagline you came up with again? She beamed, parroting a line I had brainstormed with her just days before. Everyone clapped. I smiled, but something inside me cracked. At home, the silence grew. Tyler spent more time in his home office with the door locked. When I'd knock, he'd say he was tired or on a call. When I'd ask about wedding plans, he'd wave me off. We'll get to it, babe. No rush. But there was rush. Our date was set, the venue booked. I was planning a life, and he was distant. One night, I walked into the kitchen to find Megan sitting on the counter, barefoot, sipping wine. Tyler stood across from her, laughing. Their laughter stopped the moment I entered. Megan hopped off the counter too quickly. Tyler cleared his throat and asked if I wanted a glass. I said no and went upstairs alone. I told myself I was overthinking, that I was tired, that weddings were stressful, that startups were demanding, but deep down, I started to feel like an outsider in my own relationship, in my own home. Even our dog, Jasper, seemed confused. He used to curl up with us on the couch, but now he waited by the stairs, ears perked, watching the three of us like he sensed something wrong. My friends noticed. You okay? One asked after brunch. You've been quiet. And Tyler? He seems off. I shrugged it off, defended him, defended Megan, because admitting something was wrong meant tearing apart the life I'd spent nearly a decade building. Then came the birthday dinner. Tyler forgot, or claimed he did. Megan remembered. She baked my favorite cake, gathered the team in the break room, even brought flowers. Tyler showed up late, gave me a hug that felt like an obligation, and left early for a client meeting. I watched him go, candlelight flickering in my untouched slice of cake. That night, I cried in the bathtub while Megan knocked on the door, asking if I needed anything. I said I was fine, but I wasn't. Not anymore. I started waking up early before either of them, just to have a moment of silence. I started keeping a journal again, something I hadn't done in years. I didn't write poems or stories, just questions. Why doesn't he look at me the same? Why does she know more about his schedule than I do? When did I start feeling like a guest in my own home? And worst of all, am I the only one who sees it? The answer I feared was yes. One weekend, while cleaning out old drawers, I found a pair of earrings tucked behind our dresser. They were small, gold hoops, nothing extravagant, but I knew they weren't mine. I asked Tyler about them. He barely glanced up from his laptop. They're probably yours. You forget things all the time. But I didn't forget. Not earrings, not anything that's small or precious. Megan walked in 10 minutes later, humming to herself, and I saw it the way Tyler looked up. Just for a moment. But it was the same look he used to reserve for me, back when love was new and simple. That glance told me everything I hadn't wanted to know. Still, I swallowed it, buried it. I kept telling myself that after the wedding, things would go back to normal, that this was just a rough patch, that maybe I was insecure, maybe even jealous, maybe it was me. But in my heart, I already knew I was losing something, or maybe I had already lost it, and I was just the last one to notice. The morning of my wedding, I woke up before the alarm. There was a soft pink glow outside the window, the kind that photographers dream of. I sat up in bed, looked at my dress hanging from the door, and told myself, this is it. No more doubts, no more second guessing. Today, I become Mrs. Emily Mitchell. My bridesmaids were already buzzing when I arrived at the venue's bridal suite. Curlers, makeup kits, champagne flutes. It was a whirlwind of excitement. Megan was there too, in her satin blush gown, hair in loose curls. She handed me a mimosa and smiled. You ready, big sis? I nodded. I even believed it. The ceremony was set outdoors under a canopy of white roses. Tyler was already there, looking devastatingly handsome in his navy suit. Guests filled the seats, soft music floated on the air. Everything was perfect. Until it wasn't. 5 minutes before I was to walk down the aisle, I remembered the flower pin. It was my late mother's, and I had wanted Dad to wear it. I rushed inside to the prep room we had used that morning. That's when it happened. The door was slightly ajar. I pushed it open quietly and saw them. Tyler's hands gripped Megan's waist. Her arms looped around his neck. They were kissing, deeply, hungrily, like lovers. Not a quick, mistaken brush of lips, not a goodbye. It was possession. I froze. For a full 10 seconds, I couldn't move, couldn't speak. My breath lodged in my throat. My heart pounded so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. Then she pulled back, looked into his eyes, and whispered, I wish this was our wedding. And he replied, someday, Meg. Someday it will be. I backed away slowly, no sound, no confrontation, just a numb silence that wrapped around me like a shroud. I didn't remember walking back to the bridal suite. I didn't remember telling the wedding coordinator that the ceremony was off. But I remembered the gasps, the confusion, the whispers. I remembered standing there, still in my gown, makeup half done, while chaos unfolded around me. Megan never returned to the bridal suite. Tyler disappeared too. I locked myself in the bathroom for an hour, staring at my reflection. The girl in the mirror looked like a stranger. Beautiful, broken, betrayed. Later that night, I packed a bag and drove to a hotel. My phone blew up with messages, friends, guests, my father, even Tyler. I didn't answer any of them. But then came the email from an anonymous account. The subject line read, you need to know the truth. Uh, Inside were screenshots, emails, chat logs, photos. They had been together for almost a year. Weekend trips Tyler claimed were conferences. A hotel receipt from Chicago, Megan's favorite city. A photo of them at a rooftop bar, arms wrapped around each other. But that wasn't the worst part. There was a forwarded internal memo from our company, a confidential board document. It detailed a proposed restructure, removing me from my director role, citing emotional volatility and conflict of interest. Tyler had signed off on it. So had Megan. They were pushing me out, personally and professionally. Everything I'd built, everything I'd sacrificed for, it was all being stripped away, not just by a stranger, but by the two people I had loved and trusted most. That night, I collapsed onto the hotel floor and screamed into a pillow until my voice cracked. The next morning, I drove to the office before sunrise. The security guard gave me a confused look, still in my wedding dress, now wrinkled and stained with mascara. I walked past him without a word. My access card still worked. I stepped into the main conference room, logged onto the system, and pulled every file I could find. HR reports, internal emails, financial statements. The deeper I dug, the more the betrayal unraveled. Tyler hadn't just taken me for granted. He had planned my erasure, quietly transferring power to himself and Megan, replacing my authority with hers. There were even drafts of press releases suggesting a leadership transition for the sake of company vision. I printed everything, packed it into a folder, then I walked into his office and left it on his desk with a single note. Don't ever contact me again. I spent the next few days hiding from the world. I turned off my phone, avoided social media. I didn't cry. I couldn't. The pain was too large for tears. It felt like drowning in cement. Then one evening, I got a voicemail from Megan. Her voice was hesitant. Emily, I didn't mean for it to happen this way. We didn't plan it, not at first. I love him. I really do. Please don't hate me. I deleted it without finishing. She didn't even sound sorry, just inconvenienced by the fallout. Tyler sent flowers, a 3-page letter, said he was confused, overwhelmed, said he still loved me, that we could talk, that we could find a way. I sent them both silence. The final blow came a week later, an official notice from the board. My employment had been terminated, effective immediately. No thank you, no severance, just a final boot out of the company I helped build from scratch. That was when it truly sank in. I had lost everything. My relationship, my job, my family, and worst of all, my sense of self. I sat on the floor of that hotel room for hours, numb. The TV played some rom-com I couldn't name, the irony sharp enough to make me laugh. A bitter, hollow sound. In the silence, one truth crystallized. No one was coming to save me. Not my father, not my friends, not even the old Tyler I kept hoping would reappear. The Emily who had believed in love, in loyalty, in building a future together, she was gone. All that remained was wreckage in a choice: stay broken or start crawling towards something new. I didn't leave the hotel for 4 days. The staff was kind. They slipped notes under the door, asking if I needed towels, water, food. I ignored them all. The curtains stayed drawn, the lights off. I lived in silence, moving only when absolutely necessary. I ate crackers and drank from the bathroom tap. My phone stayed on airplane mode. The world outside could have burned, and I wouldn't have known or cared. Sleep was a joke. When I closed my eyes, I saw them. Tyler and Megan tangled together, whispering promises that should have been mine. I saw our wedding arch, the scattered rose petals, guests in their best clothes, watching an empty aisle. I felt like a ghost, like I died that day and no one had noticed. The worst part, I missed them. Not the people they had become, but the ones I thought they were. The sister who braided my hair before dates. The man who once memorized every line of my favorite poem. I mourned them like a death, and in many ways it was. One afternoon, I caught my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes swollen. I didn't recognize myself. So I turned away. I tried writing, just a few lines, hoping it would clear my mind. But every sentence became a scream. Every word turned bitter. Eventually, I called my dad. He didn't ask questions, just said, "Come home." So I did. Back in my childhood room, I curled up under the same quilt I'd had since high school. I slept, really slept, for the first time in weeks. My father left trays of food outside the door. My stepmother checked in softly, never pushing. It was the silence I needed. But healing didn't come easy. I couldn't bring myself to check email or even turn on the TV. Everything felt tainted. Everyone seemed suspect. What hurt most was how easily they had replaced me. The company website now listed Megan as creative director. Tyler had posted a new brand video featuring the two of them smiling, shaking hands with clients. No mention of me, not even a whisper. It was as if I had never existed. And for a moment, I almost gave in to that idea. Maybe I wasn't enough. Maybe I had imagined the love, the partnership, the purpose. Maybe I had asked for too much. I stopped eating. I lost weight. My father begged me to see someone. I agreed half-heartedly. The therapist office smelt like mint and linen. She asked me to tell my story. I laughed. Which part, the love story or the horror movie? But over time, something strange happened. In that quiet room, in those endless sessions, I started to hear my own voice again. Not the confident woman I used to be, not yet, but the girl underneath it all. The one who loved books, who dreamed of being a writer before she ever dreamed of being someone's wife. I picked up my journal again. At first, I just listed things, the way sunlight hit the windowsill, the scent of fresh coffee, a song I used to love. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't profound, but it was mine. Mason called. We hadn't spoken in years. He was a friend from college, someone who used to tease me for crying during film credits. He'd heard what happened. Everyone had, and wanted to check in. I hesitated, then picked up. We talked for 2 hours about anything but Tyler, about books, dogs, hiking trails. He didn't treat me like I was broken. He just listened. And in that, I found something like oxygen. He texted again the next day, then the next. I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, but I didn't need to. Just having someone who remembered who I used to be before all the titles, before all the betrayal, was enough. One morning, I woke up and didn't feel dread, just emptiness. And even that was an improvement. I ran for a walk. I brushed my hair. I made toast. Tiny acts, monumental effort. I was still shattered, but at least I was moving. Some days were harder than others. I'd see a couple holding hands and feel my stomach twist. I'd hear a laugh that sounded like hers and freeze. But the difference was I no longer let those moments define my entire day. I began to imagine a future again. Not a grand one, not yet. Just a quiet one. A life that was mine alone, not built around someone else's dreams. And for the first time in a long time, I thought maybe, just maybe, I could start over. Recovery didn't arrive like a sunrise. It came in fragments, moments of clarity between waves of grief. One of those moments came when Mason sent me a book. It was a dog-eared copy of The Art of Possibility, full of his underlines and notes in the margins. There was a sticky note on the cover. Start something new, even if it's just for you. I didn't know what new meant anymore, but I opened the book. A week later, I opened my laptop. I stared at the blinking cursor on a blank document. The same screen that once filled me with dread now felt like a door. I began writing. Not about Tyler or Megan, but about a woman who rediscovers herself after loss. Fiction, but not really. I wrote for hours. I didn't care if it was good. I just needed to do it. Soon it became a habit. Morning tea, laptop, write. By the end of the month, I had 3 chapters, then 10, then a manuscript. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was mine. I shared a few pages with Mason. He replied with one sentence, "You found your voice again." Encouraged, I began freelancing. Small gigs, editing, content writing, blog posts. I even helped a local nonprofit revamp their website. My skills hadn't left me. They'd just been buried under heartbreak. Meanwhile, therapy continued. My sessions moved from silence to storytelling. My therapist urged me to reclaim my narrative. You were never just someone's fiancé. You were a creator, a leader, a sister before they betrayed you. That hit me hard because it was true. I stopped checking on Tyler and Megan. I unfollowed, blocked, deleted. It wasn't bitterness, it was boundary. I moved out of my father's house and rented a small apartment in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't glamorous, but it had light, plants, peace. Mason visited one weekend. We walked for hours, no agenda, just comfort. He didn't ask how I was doing. He already knew. And when he hugged me goodbye, I didn't flinch. I leaned in. Trust, I realized, could be rebuilt. I started attending a local writers group, sharing pieces, listening to others. I was the only one writing fiction rooted in heartbreak, but no one judged. One woman told me, "Your pain has rhythm, it breathes." It was the first time I cried in months. Not out of despair, but because someone saw me, really saw me. With time, I pitched my manuscript to a few small presses. 2 rejected me, 1 asked for revisions, the 4th said yes. When I got the acceptance email, I didn't jump or scream. I just sat there, staring at the screen, tears running down my face. Quiet joy. I called Mason. He drove over that night with a bottle of cheap champagne and plastic cups. We toasted on my balcony, laughing like college kids. "You did it," he said. "No," I corrected him. "I survived." "Then I did it." That fall, I spoke at a panel for women entrepreneurs who had experienced personal loss. I stood on that stage, heart pounding, hands shaking, and told my story. Every eye in the room stayed locked on mine. Some women cried, some nodded. Afterward, a girl hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for not pretending you were okay the whole time." It hit me then. Healing isn't linear, and sometimes helping others helps us more. I built a small consulting agency, just me and a few freelancers at first. We helped female-led startups with branding and storytelling. Every client felt like a reclamation. I didn't just rebuild my life, I redefined it. One afternoon, I found a photo of myself, pre-Tyler, college Emily, beaming, with ink on her hands and a notebook in her lap. I taped it to my mirror, not to remember who I was, but to celebrate who I'd returned to. Sometimes, when I walk past couples in parks or watch siblings laughing in cafes, I still feel that flicker of pain, of loss, of memory. But it no longer owns me. It reminds me that I endured, that I rebuilt from ashes without turning to stone. The past no longer holds the pen, I do. And every day I choose what story to write next. I started taking photos again of clouds, of cracks in the pavement, of old buildings, things I used to love before I got lost in someone else's world. Every shutter click felt like a tiny piece of myself returning home. It wasn't about the pictures. It was about seeing beauty again, about choosing to witness life instead of hiding from it. A year after the wedding, I was invited to speak at a tech and branding conference in San Francisco. At first, I hesitated. The industry was still full of faces from my past, but my name had grown quietly, steadily. My agency had just launched a breakthrough campaign for a wellness startup that went viral. People were asking who was behind it. I was no longer just Emily Harper, the ex. It was Emily Harper, the strategist, the storyteller. I flew out with Mason, who by then had become not just a friend, but a presence in my life I didn't want to imagine being without. He wasn't my boyfriend, not yet. We didn't label it. But he was the one I called when I couldn't sleep, the one who made me laugh without trying. The conference was at a sleek downtown hotel, packed with industry leaders, influencers, and venture capitalists. I wore a deep green jumpsuit, tailored and sharp, hair pinned, lips red. Confidence, not as armor, but as truth. I walked into the panel room, and there he was, Tyler. They were seated in the second row. Megan looked thinner, her smile tight. Tyler looked almost surprised to see me walk onto the stage. The topic of my panel was resilience in branding, how to tell the truth after a fall. The irony wasn't lost on me. I didn't flinch. Instead, I opened with a line I had practiced only once. Sometimes losing everything is the best thing that ever happens to your story. The room fell silent. Then it leaned in. I spoke clearly, calmly, about building something new after betrayal, about how personal scars can become professional strength, about how vulnerability, when channeled well, is power. I didn't name names. I didn't need to. Afterward, people came up to thank me, to hug me, to ask for coffee, collaboration, advice. Tyler stayed in his seat. Megan tried to approach, but I turned before she reached me. Walked away, heels clicking like punctuation. Later that night, I was invited to a rooftop after party. Mason and I arrived just as the lights dimmed and the city skyline blazed behind us. That's when I heard it. Wait. It was the head of a VC firm that had once backed Tyler's startup. The man shook my hand firmly. We've been following your work. You've built something powerful. If you're ever looking to scale, we'd love to talk. He handed me his card. Mason raised an eyebrow and I just smiled. The next day, a tech blog published a highlight of the panel. My quote, "Losing everything clarified who I am," was the headline. Comments poured in, former colleagues, new fans, even quiet apologies from people who'd once sided with Tyler. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. The narrative had shifted, and I was no longer the victim. I was the voice. Weeks later, my agency got a call. A global cosmetics brand wanted us to lead their North American rebrand. I didn't even blink before saying yes. The launch event was a month later in New York, a black tie gala at the Met. As creative lead, I was given the closing remarks. I stood under the chandeliers, thousands of eyes watching, and this time I wore white, not a wedding dress, a sleek, sculpted gown that made me feel invincible. Midway through the speech, I caught a glimpse of Tyler and Megan at the edge of the crowd. I hadn't invited them. Of course I hadn't. But they had connections, and clearly they couldn't resist watching what I'd become. So I looked them straight in the eye as I finished. Sometimes, when you lose your place in someone else's story, you finally get to write your own. The room erupted in applause. After the event, Mason met me with a glass of champagne. "You didn't just survive," he said. "You dominated." I smiled. No revenge, just elevation. We toasted to growth, to clarity, to starting over on our own terms. Back at my apartment that night, I slipped off my heels and sank into the couch. I thought about the girl who once cried in a hotel bathroom, broken and lost. She wouldn't recognize this version of me, and that was okay because I didn't rebuild her. I rebuilt someone better. A week later, I got a package in the mail, no name, no return address. Inside was a framed photo from college, me, Tyler, and Megan at some campus party, all laughing. Someone had written across the glass in marker, "Was it ever real?" I didn't cry. I didn't rage. Just dropped it into the trash and walked away. I had a meeting to prep for, a future to shape, and no more time for ghosts. Later that month, I was interviewed by a women's leadership podcast. When they asked what advice I'd give my younger self, I paused. Then I said, "Don't tie your worth to being chosen. Build a life so rich, so real, that even losing everything can't shake it." The episode went viral, emails poured in, messages from strangers, from women who had been hurt, abandoned, overlooked. They saw themselves in me. And now they saw a way forward. It started quietly, whispers among investors, rumors in the press, a drop in user engagement, a glitchy product update that led to hundreds of angry tweets. Tyler's startup was floundering, and not just because of the tech. Word spread about internal instability, creative turnover, poor leadership, a revolving door of vision with no direction, one article said. And at the heart of it, a couple whose romance had become the brand, and now the liability. I didn't revel in it, not at first. But then I got a message from an old colleague. "Have you seen the Times piece?" she asked. "They quoted your old pitch line without credit." I clicked the link. There it was, my work, my phrasing, presented as Megan's. A sting returned, sharp, familiar, but this time I didn't cry. I called my lawyer. The cease and desist went out the next morning. 2 days later, I received a formal apology and a quiet settlement. The article was edited, the credit corrected. Meanwhile, their product tanked. The launch of version 3 was a PR disaster. Customers left in droves, investors pulled out, the board began restructuring, this time without Tyler. It went radio silent. Megan, however, did not. She emailed me, no subject line, just 2 sentences. "I'm sorry, I was scared. I thought he loved me." I stared at the message for a long time, then deleted it. Not because I hated her, because I had nothing left to say. One afternoon, months later, I passed Megan on the street. She was alone, no assistant, no entourage, just a woman in a wrinkled blazer, walking fast, looking tired. Our eyes met. She opened her mouth, maybe to speak, maybe to ask for something. I smiled. Then I walked right past her, afraid. Later that week, I got lunch with a mutual acquaintance, someone still plugged into that world. "They're trying to raise again," he said, sipping his espresso. "No one's biting. Tyler's out. Megan's clinging to what's left. Honestly, it's kind of sad." I nodded but didn't comment. He looked at me. "You could crush them. One call and you'd bury their chances." I shook my head. "They're already buried." And I'm not in the business of graves. It was the truth. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted peace. And I had it. But life, poetic as it often is, wasn't done. Months later, I was invited to judge a regional startup pitch competition. Sitting among the panelists, flipping through the packet of names and bios, I froze. Megan Turner, solo founder, a beauty tech concept that felt eerily familiar. Her name was last on the list. When she stepped onto the stage, our eyes met again. She faltered, just slightly, then began her pitch. It wasn't bad, but it wasn't inspired. When it ended, the room was quiet. I thanked her politely, offered measured feedback, no spite, no cruelty, just honesty. She nodded. Her hands trembled. She didn't win. After the event, I saw her slip out the back door, shoulders hunched. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt finished. The chapter closed quietly, and I didn't need applause to know I'd won. In the weeks that followed, people asked me if I felt vindicated, if seeing them fall gave me closure. I told them no. Closure didn't come from their downfall. It came from my choice not to chase it. I had built something new, something that couldn't be taken or mimicked. They had each other. Then they had ambition, and that they had nothing. And if I had myself, and for the first time in a long time, that was more than enough. The last time I stood in front of a mirror wearing white, my life was crumbling behind a locked door. This time, I stood tall, calm, centered, not a bride, not a victim, just a woman who had rebuilt her life, one boundary, one word, one breath at a time. The past didn't haunt me anymore. It humbled me. I didn't pretend it hadn't hurt. That would have been a lie. Tyler and Megan didn't just betray me. They took things I'd spent years building. But pain is a strange teacher, cruel, but honest. And it taught me who I was when everything else was stripped away. I was capable, I was resilient. I was still here. The book I wrote, Born from Heartbreak, was now in its third reprint. My agency had expanded. I had a team, a vision, clients who respected my voice. Mason and I had finally stopped dodging the label. He wasn't a rebound. He wasn't a fix. He was a partner. Not in the fairy tale sense, but in the quiet, daily kind of love that stays. We took trips, read books, cooked late dinners, argued sometimes, laughed often, loved simply. One night, while walking Jasper along the pier, I looked up at the skyline and thought, this is it. This is peace. Not perfection, but peace. I had learned to live without the need to be chosen, without needing to be the hero of someone else's narrative. I had stopped measuring success by how many people clapped. I started measuring it by how I felt when I woke up each morning. Some mornings were still hard, triggers still came, but healing wasn't a finish line. It was a practice. And I practiced every day. I wrote in my journal. I forgave myself. I let go of the urge to explain my story to people who'd never really listened. I honored the girl who gave everything to people who couldn't hold it, and the woman who learned when to stop. The lesson wasn't don't trust, it was trust wisely. The lesson wasn't don't love, it was love without abandoning yourself. One afternoon, I received an email from a young woman who had read my book. She said she was days away from marrying someone she didn't feel safe with until she read my chapter on silence and intuition. She called off her wedding. She thanked me for saving her, but I hadn't saved her. I had only shared the truth. And that was the greatest gift pain had given me. Clarity. Clarity to speak. Clarity to choose. Clarity to walk away. Tyler and Megan were chapters, not the whole book. The ending belonged to me. and I chose to write it with grace, not because they deserved it, but as I did. Now, when I'm asked what I learned through it all, I say this: your worth is not up for debate. Your story does not need permission. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is simply begin again. With your head high, your heart steady, and your pen in your own hand. Is the real love story. It's the one you write for yourself. And that's the story I live now. Not a comeback, not revenge, just a woman fully awake in her own life. That's more than a happy ending. That's freedom.